Alec Rose's world shattered when sickness stole her beloved Daniel. She thought the crushing grief was the worst pain imaginable. She was wrong. Just moments after saying her final goodbye, a chilling nightmare began. Officials doubted her marriage, questioned her identity, and tried to erase her very truth. How could her love be dismissed? How could her pain be twisted into suspicion? This isn't just a story of a widow's sorrow, it's a shocking, unbelievable fight for dignity, for justice, and for the right to be seen when the world tries to make you invisible. Her battle against an unseen enemy will shock you to your core.
I never thought I would be telling this story. Not like this. Not with tears still threatening to fall every time I remember that day. My name is Alec Rose, and what I went through, it's something that changed me completely. I guess I should start at the beginning, the part of my life that seemed ordinary, before everything turned upside down. I had a life that many would call normal. I worked in a small office downtown, mostly paperwork and phone calls, and came home to the little apartment my husband and I shared. We weren't rich, we weren't famous, but we had something I thought would last forever: love. His name was Daniel, and he wasn't just my husband, he was my anchor, my calm in every storm, the one person who made the world feel safe even when it wasn't. I remember the mornings we shared coffee at our tiny kitchen table, talking about our day, laughing at nothing, making plans for a future that felt endless. Everything seemed perfect, in that quiet, ordinary way that makes people jealous without realizing it. People around me, neighbors, co-workers, they didn't know about the small arguments we had, the nights I cried quietly when life felt overwhelming, or the moments Daniel held me just to remind me that I wasn't alone. They saw smiles, hand-holding, little gestures of love. And in those moments, I felt untouchable. But life, I learned, doesn't care about perfect moments. It doesn't care about love, or plans, or promises. It comes crashing in when you least expect it. For us, it started quietly, almost invisibly. Daniel got a cough at first, nothing alarming. Then a pain in his chest that he brushed off as fatigue. But I noticed things, the way he winced sometimes, the nights he couldn't sleep, the way his laughter didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. I suggested we go to the doctor, and at first, it was nothing serious, they said. But deep down, I felt it. A shadow creeping in that I couldn't shake. Soon, the tests began. Hospital visits. Blood work. Scans. Every report made my stomach twist, every doctor's frown made my heart sink. And then, finally, the news came that shattered the world I had built: Daniel was dying. The words are simple, but the weight is unbearable. There's nothing more we can do, they said, looking at me like I was supposed to understand something I didn't. I wanted to scream, to throw myself at them, to beg them to fix it. But there was nothing. Nothing except that slow, creeping realization that the person who held my entire world in his hands was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I spent every moment by his side after that. I held his hand, traced his features, memorized every line, every scar, every little thing that made him who he was. I whispered that I loved him over and over, even though I thought he could already hear it. The hospital room became our world: white walls, beeping machines, the smell of antiseptic. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't gentle. It was raw, brutal, and unforgiving. But it was ours. And then came the day I had to say goodbye. I remember the hallway outside the room, the way the light from the windows hit the floor, the way my knees shook as I walked toward the exit. I wanted to stay, to never leave, but I had to step out, to breathe, to survive. Tears blurred my vision. Every step felt like carrying a boulder, my chest tight, my heart hollow. I didn't know how to go on, didn't know if I even wanted to. I thought the hardest part was over. I thought the world couldn't hurt me more than losing him. I was wrong. Because as soon as I stepped out into that sterile hallway, the world I thought I knew began to crumble in ways I could never have imagined. It started with whispers, eyes that lingered too long, subtle looks of judgment. People who had once smiled at me turned away. Little things, at first, small enough to dismiss. But I could feel the weight of it. The quiet, suffocating doubt that made me question myself. And I knew, deep down, that what was coming next would test me in ways that went beyond grief. I couldn't have prepared myself for what happened when I tried to handle the arrangements. Every form, every signature, every small step that should have been simple was met with suspicion. Questions I shouldn't have had to answer. Assumptions about me that weren't true. Every time I tried to explain, the room seemed colder, the people sharper, the words slicing deeper than I thought possible. It wasn't just about my husband anymore. It was about me, my identity, my truth, my very existence being questioned because of things I couldn't control. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. The world could be cruel not just in loss, but in judgment. Not just in death, but in the way it treats people when they are most vulnerable. It wasn't just my grief I was carrying anymore. It was the weight of everyone who had been doubted, dismissed, or erased. And suddenly, I understood that this story, the one I thought belonged only to me, was part of a much bigger story, one I had no choice but to confront. I walked out of that office that day, heart pounding, chest aching, unsure if I could breathe. I felt small, exposed, and completely alone. But also, somewhere deep inside, something began to stir. A flicker of defiance. A spark of strength. If the world thought it could erase my truth, it had another thing coming. I didn't know how I would fight, or if I could win, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't let them take my story. Not now. Not ever. And that was where it began, the moment when ordinary life ended, and my real journey started. The moment I discovered that grief was only one part of the fight, and courage was something I would have to claim for myself, step by trembling step. I remember stepping out of the hospital and feeling like the air itself was heavier than usual. Every breath seemed thick, filled with grief and confusion. I kept replaying Daniel's last moments in my mind, over and over, wishing I could rewind time, wishing I could somehow take back that final goodbye. But I couldn't. And the world, I realized, wasn't going to let me pause my pain in peace. At first, it was the small things. People avoiding my gaze, conversations that seemed to halt when I entered a room, subtle snickers behind closed doors. I thought maybe I was imagining it, that grief had made me hyper-aware. But the signs became impossible to ignore. The office handling my husband's affairs suddenly treated me like an intruder, questioning documents that had been perfectly legal, asking about things I had no reason to answer. Each interaction was a reminder that my pain alone wasn't enough. Somehow, I also had to prove my worth, my truth, my very identity. That I started noticing patterns I hadn't seen before. Forms would go missing, signatures that should have been simple became mountains of questioning, and people who had once been kind suddenly seemed to doubt my every word. And there it was again, the quiet, suffocating weight of judgment. It wasn't shouted at me, not yet. But I could feel it in every glance, every paused smile, every sigh that seemed meant for me alone. Then came the moment that truly opened my eyes to the world I was stepping into. I walked into the records office one afternoon, papers in hand, thinking I could finally resolve the last of Daniel's affairs. But the receptionist's face froze when she saw me. Her smile vanished, replaced with suspicion, sharp and cutting. "Are you certain you're his wife?" she asked. The words weren't loud, but they hit me harder than anything else had. My heart stopped for a second, and I had to force myself to be Eve. I was certain. I had lived, laughed, loved, and cried with him for years. How could she doubt that? The questions kept coming, more invasive and painful than I could imagine. They asked about timelines, about documents, about my presence in the hospital. Every answer I gave seemed to make them colder, more suspicious. I could feel every eye in the room on me, every silent judgment pressing down like an invisible weight. My hands shook, my chest tightened, but I refused to let tears fall. Not yet. Not in front of them, and then he appeared. The man in the uniform I had only seen in passing before, now standing directly in front of me. His eyes didn't soften. His voice didn't carry empathy. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside," he said, calm but firm, as though I were the problem in a room filled with problems. In that moment, the air felt like it had thickened, and the world itself seemed to shrink around me. Fear surged through me, sharp and icy, but beneath it, anger began to burn. How dare they treat me like this? How dare they question my life, my grief, my very truth when all I wanted was to honor Daniel? Every ounce of pain and injustice fueled me, gave me courage I didn't know I had. I realized that if I didn't fight in that moment, my voice, my story, would be silenced. And that was something I could not allow. That I started speaking, my voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with every word. I explained everything, our life together, the documents, the nights in the hospital, the love that could not be measured by a signature or a form. I spoke of Daniel not as a memory, but as a living, breathing person whose presence had filled every part of my life. Every word I said felt like a small act of rebellion, a refusal to let the world rewrite my story without me, but their doubt did not vanish. The receptionist's face remained sharp, the uniformed man's expression unmoving. Even as I finished, there was silence, thick, heavy, suffocating. I realized then that this fight was not about paperwork. It was about recognition, about dignity, about being seen as human when systems seemed determined to erase you. And in that silence, I knew the worst wasn't over. Later, outside the office, I sat on a bench, trying to calm my shaking hands, trying to make sense of what had happened. The sun was setting, painting the city in orange and pink, but I barely noticed. My mind replayed every glance, every question, every word. How could the world be so cruel, even in ordinary spaces where nothing extraordinary should happen? How could they doubt me when I had lost everything, and yet, somewhere deep inside, a strange clarity began to form. I realized that this struggle, this suffocating, humiliating, infuriating struggle, was bigger than me. It wasn't just about Daniel, or the office, or that one day. It was about the countless people who had been doubted, dismissed, or erased because of who they were, what they looked like, or where they came from. I understood then that my fight, as personal and painful as it was part of a larger fight for justice, for truth, for recognition. The anger simmered, but so did a growing determination. I wasn't going to let them erase Daniel's memory, or mine. I didn't know exactly how I would navigate the next days, the weeks, or the months, but I knew I had to. I had to find a way to face them, to reclaim my voice, to make sure that my story, and Daniel's story, was heard and respected. Even as the night fell and the city lights flickered on, I felt that fire inside me, quiet but unyielding. I knew the journey ahead would be hard, maybe harder than anything I had faced before. But I also knew that giving up was not an option. Not for me. Not for Daniel. Not for anyone who had ever been doubted or dismissed. And in that moment, sitting alone on the bench, with my heart still raw and my hands still trembling, I made a silent promise. No matter what came next, I would face it. I would fight. I would survive. And I would tell this story, no matter how long it took, no matter how hard it got, so that the world could finally see the truth of what had happened to us, and to me. That I woke up the next morning with a weight pressing on my chest that I couldn't shake. It wasn't just grief anymore, it was anger, frustration, a sense of injustice that made every movement feel heavy. I knew what I had faced yesterday, the questioning, the doubt, the way people had looked at me as if I didn't belong, but I hadn't realized how much it would stay with me, shadowing every thought, every heartbeat. That I tried to distract myself, busying my mind with small tasks, but even making coffee felt hollow. Every sound, every passing stranger, every phone notification seemed to echo the whispers I had felt the day before. Are you really his wife? Are you certain? Those words kept circling in my head, each repetition burning a little deeper, like acid on fragile skin. I felt exposed, raw, and utterly powerless that I had no choice but to go back, to face it all again. The office, the officials, the paperwork, they weren't going to disappear, and neither could I. I knew that if I avoided it, the doubts would grow louder, not just for them, but inside me too. So I steeled myself, took a deep breath, and stepped through the glass doors once more, each step echoing in the nearly empty hallway. My hands trembled, but I kept them clasped tightly in front of me, as if holding on to something tangible could anchor me against the tide of fear and anger swelling inside. They were waiting. The same people who had questioned me yesterday looked at me with cold eyes, as though my presence alone was an irritation. I handed over the documents, careful to keep my voice steady, to appear composed. But inside, my mind raced. Every glance, every movement, every quest. Ion felt like a test, like a trap waiting to spring. And in many ways, it was. The man in the uniform stepped forward again. He didn't speak at first, just stared, his gaze sharp, measuring. My heart hammered in my chest. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that he had no right to judge me, to question me, to make me feel like an intruder in my own life. But instead, I took a deep breath and began to speak, letting my words carry the weight of truth, of years of shared memories, of love that could not be measured by signatures or forms. As I spoke, I could feel the tension in the room mounting. Each word seemed to land harder than the last, yet their expressions didn't soften. The receptionist leaned forward, scrutinizing every paper, every gesture. Every time I tried to finish a sentence, she would interrupt, asking more questions, casting doubt on the smallest details. My voice wavered, but I refused to stop. I had to speak. I had to be heard, and then came the moment I will never forget. The man in uniform stepped closer, his shadow falling over the table, over the papers, over everything I had brought with me. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step aside," he said, calm, but there was a firmness in his tone that sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, unable to understand how mere words could make me feel so powerless, so exposed. Anger and fear collided inside me. My hands shook, my throat burned, and tears threatened to spill, but I couldn't let them. Not yet. I realized then that this wasn't just about Daniel anymore, or even about me. It was about standing up in the face of something far bigger, an invisible force that dismissed people like me, that questioned our existence, our dignity, our right to grieve without scrutiny. That I found the courage to speak again, my voice steady this time, filled with the pain and defiance I didn't know I had. I told them everything, about Daniel, about our life, about the nights I had held him and whisper. Love into the darkness. I told them about the dreams we had, the ordinary moments that had meant everything, the memories they could never erase. And with every word, I felt something inside me shift. I was no longer just a grieving wife. I was a person demanding recognition, demanding that the truth be seen. They didn't respond immediately. The room was silent, thick with tension, every second stretching endlessly. I could feel every eye on me, every thought weighing me down, but also, somewhere deep inside, a spark of something I hadn't felt before: defiance. Strength. The realization that if I didn't claim my voice, no one else would. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. Paperwork was scrutinized, questions were asked, doubt was cast, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, I noticed a shift. A pause in the harsh judgment, a hesitation in their words. Perhaps my determination, my unwillingness to be erased, had forced them to see me, not just as a woman alone in grief, but as someone whose truth could not be dismissed. That I left that office that evening exhausted, drained, and shaken to my core. But there was a flicker of something new, something dangerous to those who had doubted me, a quiet fire that wouldn't be extinguished. I realized that my fight had only just begun. The injustice I had faced wasn't confined to one office or one person. It was a reflection of a system, of society, of the countless ways people like me are doubted, questioned, and dismissed. And if I wanted change, if I wanted my voice heard, I would have to confront it all, no matter how painful. Walking back through the city streets, the sun setting behind the tall buildings, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. Fear still lingered, but it no longer had the same power over me. The world had tried to make me small, to make my grief invisible, but I had refused. I had taken my first step in a fight I wasn't sure I could win, but one I had to start anyway, and in that moment, alone on the quiet street, I made a promise to myself and to Daniel. I would not let this story end in silence. I would not let the world forget the love we shared, the truth of my experience, or the injustice I had faced. I didn't know what the next days would bring, but I knew this: I was ready to face it all. The fear, the anger, the heartbreak, it was all mine to carry, and all mine to fight through, because some battles aren't just about winning, they're about surviving, being seen, and refusing to be erased. And I knew that my story, our story, was far from over. I will never forget the moment it all came crashing down. The tension, the fear, the helplessness, it hit me like a physical blow, a wave that knocked the breath right out of me. I had faced doubt and suspicion before, but nothing prepared me for the absolute weight of being questioned in the place I thought should have been safe. The office was silent except for the sound of shuffling papers and the occasional beep of a machine somewhere in the building, but it felt deafening. Every eye on me, every look of judgment, pressed against my chest. The man in the uniform, the same one who had shadowed me before, stepped closer. His presence was like a wall closing in, the air between us heavy and suffocating. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but edged with authority, "we need you to explain the discrepancies in your documents." I froze. Discrepancies. I had checked everything. Every signature, every form, every paper had been in perfect order. And yet, here I was, standing accused, judged, doubted in my deepest grief. A fire erupted inside me, a mixture of fear, anger, and desperate determination. My throat burned, my hands shook, but I forced my voice to remain steady. Everything here is accurate. Every word, every document. My husband and I lived this life together. I am telling the truth. My words echoed in the room, but the silence that followed felt like judgment itself. Then came the question that almost broke me: are you certain you're his wife? Are you absolutely sure you belong here? It was a simple question, yet it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I could feel tears building, hot and relentless, but I swallowed them. I couldn't let them see my weakness, not now. Not after everything I had endured, everything I had fought for, and then it hit me, the crushing realization that this wasn't just about paperwork. It was about recognition. About dignity. About whether my grief, my love, my very existence, could be dismissed because someone decided I didn't fit their narrative. I had lost Daniel, yes, but now the world seemed determined to strip me of even his memory, as if questioning me could erase him entirely. Something inside me shifted. The fear remained, sharp and biting, but beneath it rose a fierce, unyielding courage. I met his eyes, the receptionist's eyes, every gaze in that room, and I refused to back down. I spoke again, my voice trembling at first, then gaining strength. I told them about Daniel, about the life we shared, the years we built together, the nights I spent holding him while he slept. I told them that love and truth could not be measured by signatures or documents. Every word I spoke carried my grief, my defiance, and my refusal to be erased. The room stayed quiet, but I could feel the shift. The coldness, the doubt, the authority, it was still there, but it was meeting something it hadn't counted on, my unshakable insistence on being seen. I wasn't just a widow. I wasn't just a grieving woman. I was someone whose story demanded recognition, and I refused to let them rewrite it. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. Every document, every explanation, every assertion was scrutinized. I felt the weight of every unjust stare, every whispered doubt. And yet, for the first time, I felt something else, a spark of power I didn't know I had. The fire of refusing to be silenced. To be doubted. To be dismissed. By the time I finally left the office, The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. My hands were still shaking, my heart still racing, but there was a strange clarity. I had faced something unimaginable and survived. I had stood in the face of doubt, judgment, and injustice, and I had refused to let it define me. That I realized, in that quiet moment as the city lights flickered on, that this fight was bigger than me. It wasn't just about Daniel. It wasn't just about me being questioned, doubted, or erased. It was about the countless others whose grief, whose stories, whose truth, was dismissed every single day. And it hit me hard, surviving wasn't enough. I needed to carry this story, to make it seen, to make it heard, not just for myself, but for every person who had ever been doubted, questioned, or erased. That I walked slowly, feeling the ache in my legs and the burn in my chest, but also the unrelenting determination that had taken root inside me. Fear still lingered, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had become fuel. Fuel to speak, to fight, to ensure that Daniel's memory, and my own dignity, would not be denied. That in that moment, I made a silent promise. I would not let this injustice define me. I would not let grief silence me. I would not let doubt erase Daniel, erase our love, erase my truth. I didn't know how long the fight would last, or what obstacles lay ahead, but I knew this: I had found a strength I didn't know I possessed, and it would carry me forward, no matter what, because sometimes, the moment that breaks you is also the moment that awakens the fiercest strength you've ever known. And standing there, alone but unbowed, I knew that my story, our story, was far from over. The world had tested me, humiliated me, questioned me, but it had also given me something it could never take: the resolve to survive, and to be seen. And even now, as I recount this, my chest still tight with the memory, I know that the hardest battles are often the ones that awaken the most powerful truths. That I walked home that evening feeling heavier than ever, though strangely lighter too. The battle in that office had left me exhausted, shaking, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline and fear, but also alive in a way I hadn't felt before. For the first time, I realized that surviving grief wasn't just about enduring the loss of someone you love, it was also about enduring the world's disbelief, its indifference, its cruelty, and refusing to be erased by it. Sitting on my couch, the apartment silent except for the soft hum of the heater, I thought about Daniel. I thought about the mornings we shared, the quiet conversations, the laughter, and the small moments that had built our life together. I thought about how easily some people had tried to dismiss that life, as though the love we had shared could be questioned, doubted, erased with a few sharp words and suspicious glances, and yet, despite it all, I felt a strange kind of peace. Not because the world had suddenly become fair or just, it hadn't, but because I had stood up. I had spoken my truth, and I had refused to let anyone take it away. I had faced doubt, prejudice, and suspicion head-on, and in doing so, I discovered something that no one could ever touch: the power of my own voice. That I knew, though, that my story was bigger than me. The injustice I had faced wasn't just a personal attack, it was part of a larger, systemic problem. So many people are doubted, questioned, and dismissed simply because of who they are, the color of their skin, or the assumptions others make about them. And I realized that my experience, as painful as it had been, was also a reminder that we all have a responsibility to bear witness, to speak up, to make sure that these rise are not ignored. In the days that followed, I started sharing my story, not in anger, but in honesty. I told friends, family, even strangers about what had happened, about the way grief and injustice had collided in my life, about the small, quiet moments of courage that had allowed me to survive. And in telling it, I felt something shift inside me. My pain, though still raw, became a source of strength. My story became a weapon against indifference and a beacon for those who might be suffering in silence. That I will never forget the lessons I learned through all of this. That grief can be exploited, that prejudice can strike even in the most ordinary places, and that fear can feel suffocating, but also that courage can be quiet, steady, and unyielding. It can come from simply refusing to let someone else define your truth. It can come from standing tall when the world expects you to crumble. And it can come from love, the kind of love that refuses to die even when the person you love does. As I sit here now, recounting every moment, I ask myself and anyone listening this question: how many more people go through this, unseen and unheard, every single day? How many lives are dismissed, doubted, or erased, simply because someone in power refuses to look closely enough, to listen carefully enough, to care deeply enough? And then I think about what we can do. We can bear witness. We can share these stories. We can refuse to ignore the pain and injustice around us. We can give voice to those who have been silenced. That is what Daniel would have wanted. That is what I now carry in his memory, the knowledge that while I could not stop his passing, I can ensure that the love we shared, and the injustice we faced, are never forgotten. So I leave you with this, not as a story of despair, but as a story of quiet defiance, resilience, and hope, even in the face of grief, even in the presence of injustice. Even when the world doubts you, you can stand. You can speak. You can survive. And in doing so, you can make sure that the truth, your truth, will never be erased, because sometimes, the moments that break us are the very moments that awaken the strongest, fiercest parts of ourselves. And as long as we have the courage to keep telling our stories, those moments will never be wasted, they will be remembered, honored, and carried forward.